Okay then, everybody, good afternoon. Thank you for finding your seats and getting your teas and coffees. We will begin the last panel of the day. My name is Geer, or Jake. I'm the Managing Director of Orbit Fab UK. We're an in-space refueling and servicing company. We're here today to talk about the nexus of space science, national security, growth, and the title you can see is Beyond the Lab. So it's particularly trying to talk to some of the scientists and academics in the room, but all of us together as a space sector about how it is we bridge the gap between these different and sometimes competing parts of the space sector. I'm joined today on the stage by two excellent panelists, both bringing very different views. I'll let them introduce themselves in a minute. We're going to have around about 30 minutes of Q&A from myself, talking with the panelists, and then throwing it open to the audience for questions at the end. So please do think of that online or in the room as well. So my panelists today, I've got two. I'll start with the first person on my left, Alexandra Vidyuk, the CEO and General Partner of Beyond Earth. Alexandra, do you want to introduce yourself more? Tell us about your view.
Thank you, Jake, and thank you for having me today. Happy to be here. I'm actually came all the way from Singapore just for this event. No, just kidding. I also have some other events. I'm actually joining the Global Space Awards in London tomorrow, the gala dinner. So Charlie actually invited me because he read my article at a technology outlet of Financial Times about James Webb. The article was saying like top 10 discoveries which contradicts the current theory about everything, like Big Bang didn't exist and so on, right? So I'm a physicist by education, as you can probably understand my passion and curiosity. But when I graduated, we didn't have cool jobs. We only did half of my class went to work for banking, half of went to work for management consultant. And 10 years after banking, and I was like, what I'm doing, it's basically making rich people more rich. It's exciting, of course, glamorous, but not impactful enough. So I started moving myself into deep tech and space tech and kind of closer to engineering and science. And a couple of years later, here I am, I'm investing in space tech and deep tech. So I run my own fund. We invest in companies, early stage startups, which doing, the official line is we invest in companies which are based on scientific breakthroughs, including space, energy, robotics, material science, communications, and so on. So it's the early stage companies. We focusing on seed and Series A. The company is US based, and I live in Singapore.
Thank you very much. And Zoha Naser, who is a PhD candidate at King's College in the War Studies Department. Zoha, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you. And thank you all for sticking around for what I think will be a fantastic panel. So I was contacted because I am a PhD candidate at King's College London, and I'm based in the Freeman Air and Space Institute, which is a interdisciplinary research group that we have at King's, and we work at a range of air and space power issues. So my kind of path into space is not very conventional. I actually come from a purely political science background, no physics, no maths, nothing. But I've always had a real passion for space, and my background is actually in very traditional kind of non-proliferation nuclear policy. But I was introduced to space in my undergraduate studies, and I became really, really interested in this kind of growing operational domain of security and warfare. And so my research actually looks at strategic stability in outer space, and I'm particularly interested in looking at how actors in space, be they nation states or independent actors, communicate a desire to maintain or establish that stability, how they choose to communicate peace, how they choose to communicate sustainability goals and efforts, why we might not be seeing so much progress on that currently in the efforts that we see going on at the national and international level, and potentially how we can bridge that gap, revisiting kind of traditional international relations theories to look at the building of trust measures globally. So yeah.
Thank you very much. And about myself, so I've been managing Orbit Fab UK for about the last 18 months. Before that, I was the UK Space Agency for several years, running their launch programme, in-orbit servicing and space domain awareness programmes. Before that, I was at the Ministry of Defence, so I know a little bit about national security. I spent around a year of my life in Afghanistan doing frontline science and analysis of various different trades and ilks. I'm actually a psychologist by my degree background, so nothing to do with space whatsoever. And part of the joy of this panel is we're trying to bring together some voices that perhaps aren't normally heard, some different pathways into the sector to bring those viewpoints from those different areas too. So really pleased to be on this panel with both of you. We're going to kick off talking about economic growth from R&D. I'm going to start with you, Alex. It's great to have a VC on a panel with you because I like VC. I want some money from VC, so I'm not going to pitch you here and now. But I am interested to know if you think about breakthrough science, so breakthrough R&D from academics and elsewhere, what is it that's so exciting about that curiosity-driven exploration science that makes you as an investor sit up and want to take notice?
Yeah, I think the VC world is changing a lot, and I just kind of one anecdote from my recent experience. I was speaking to a $1 billion fund in Silicon Valley, and they invested in 2 space companies, and they're like, oh, we invest in like fintech, software, crypto, and everything. And these 2 companies were like the most risky, crazy people. Like, why did we invest? And then DeepSeek happened, right? And the entire portfolio of software products, websites, apps became, there's no moat. The next version of DeepSeek can be read over weekend, right? So these 2 space companies became the most safe and most secure for that company. And I see that's happening a lot as well, right? So are we expecting another Amazon or Google, or are we expecting another NVIDIA or another SpaceX? Look at top 10 companies today in terms of the capitalization, right? 9 of them are deep tech companies. And people ask me, like, what is deep tech? I always say it's based on scientific breakthrough. But what does it mean? It means that deep tech is not trying to optimize a small bit of an enterprise, as what most of the software companies do. Deep tech transforming often several industries in the same time. In terms of the value creation for our society, for our civilization, and of course for me, I make more money from that, right? So that's why we invest in deep tech. And I also like the way how it's changing now, the way how we speak to founders. In our team, we have 5 people and 3 PhDs. And one of my colleagues, he was a serial entrepreneur for the last 15 years, and he was hiding he has a PhD. And now, finally, he updated his LinkedIn profile, calling him doctor. And I have several founders who ask me, we are not going to speak to a VC if you don't have a PhD. We don't want to talk to people who are spreadsheeters and finance people. We want to talk to people who understand what we are doing. And this is a positive change. Of course, maybe we're happy that we have PhDs in the team, but that's exactly the new world. And this is the world where I live. So I think, deep tech investments, and it's a filter for VCs as well.
Interesting. I like the idea that VC should speak the language of science as well as science speaking the language of VCs as well. And if I may, just to follow up for you, Alex, you mentioned a moat there. Now, I know what you mean by a moat, but to the audience, can you just explain what you mean by that and why it's important to deep tech investing?
So, vibe coding, everyone can do it. My 3-year-old daughter can do web coding, right? People like, just can you please rewrite me this app, website, whatever, right? Can DeepSeek build a fusion reactor? Can DeepSeek build a rocket? Not yet, right? So maybe at least not in the current version. So that was we're talking about moat, right? So software products, software businesses almost have no moat today unless they have strong IP. Deep tech startups, we typically see multiple patents, multiple know-how, multiple very deep knowledge, deep IP. So that's why we call it moat. Even the worst thing what can happen if the company go bankrupt, we still can sell patents, right? That's why we like it.
So that moat is as a way of protecting your business or your IP against a competitor coming in is important to investors, obviously. And it's interesting when we talk about breakthrough science, we're talking about deep tech. You use those words synonymously. I'm not sure everyone does. It's interesting to see how that grows. Zoha, turning to you and thinking less about the investment angle, more about the overall, the macroeconomic, maybe, if that's the right term. How do you think the science community can better articulate its strategic economic value to policymakers and governments?
Yeah, I kind of want to pick up on something that Alexandra kind of touched on as well. And I'm not just plugging this because I have colleagues who contributed to this report, but the House of Lords Space Economy report talked a lot about this idea of speaking the language of users and telling a story about space science. And I think it's one of the most important kind of things we have to think about going forward in terms of communicating the value and communicating this to policymakers, because you have a broad community of people from different backgrounds who may not necessarily recognize the importance of space to their lives. And I think it's kind of a theme that we've picked up throughout the day-to-day, is just how much of our day-to-day lives are impacted by space. And it's something that somebody like myself, who doesn't have a background in space, might not have realized until I started working on it recently. And there are policymakers, individuals involved in government who will be working on kind of space or space adjacent roles who may not also recognize the strategic value. So I think it's important to kind of follow that thread through and speak that language and tell that story. I think potentially touching on kind of some of the discussions we had earlier today, how we tell that story is maybe a bit difficult to start thinking about, but it's something that we need to definitely kind of factor in going forward when it comes to communicating the strategic value of space science.
Okay, yeah, and I remember as a government person talking to a lot of scientists. They talk about the cool things they're doing and what it is and how it works. They didn't talk so much about the return on investment, which is interesting to VCs as well, or the job creation or the long run benefit to the economy, particularly in terms of inspiring the next generation of scientists or technologists or engineers or mathematicians. There is always an angle there to be played up with science that sometimes actually people forget about or just assume it's known. Sometimes you've got to say that in very blunt and quantitative terms too. And if I'm thinking about space science and research and making it attractive, what can researchers do, Alex, to get into your inbox and then to make themselves investable to a VC like you, if you're thinking about that?
I always like this example. So it took 10 years for James Webb Telescope to raise 10 billion. It's like one of the biggest mega science projects in the world. And it took Mira Murati to raise 2 billion for her new project without even a presentation, right? And it was oversubscribed. What's happening? Why our society, why do we need to be convinced that, science is important, takes a lot of debates and public money, but, everyone is asking, every one of my investors in the fund asking, like, do you have an allocation in DeepSeek, right? We wanted to be there. So it's a psychology, right? It's a FOMO and everything. So I think in terms of the language and what we see typically is, the main concern which investors have is that this is not, it's R&D, it's not a real business, right? Look at them, they have no traction, they have no contract. This is just a bunch of crazy scientists want to do something. That's not what we see, right? So how to avoid this comment? And I think it's different in the US and in Europe. So in Europe, Europe and Asia is very similar. Numbers, projections, financial models, how many pilots you've done, how many MOUs you signed. 20. Okay, so you're a hustler. You will keep hustling these people, right? In the US, it's a bit different. People don't like numbers. People like, put a picture of Mars on a slide and say, we're going there, give us 10 million, right? So it's kind of, it's a way how we change language, right? I think it's also important to understand that, don't talk to wrong people. If people invest in NFT collections, just don't try to sell them deep tech, right? I always do is just code like Gemini, this is the, this is a potential VC. How can I pitch them? What do they like? What's the previous investments they've done? What language do they speak? Right? That's now easy. You can like mass market the customization for the pitches. I think people like one of the main what we like to see is revenue. If you don't have revenue, contracts. If you don't have contracts, have we started talking to our customers? What do they say? Do they like? Do they want to do pilots? Do they want to do MVPs? Did they sign anything indicating that they're actually potentially interested in the product? And do we understand how to actually talk to our government contracts and to our government clients? And it might take sometimes up to 5 years to sell them. right? And have we started? Do we understand this route and like what would be the application? Yeah.
Thank you. I think that we talk about traction a bit there, and particularly as you go further into the growth stages of venture capitalist funding from seed to Series A or B, seeing those commercial or governmental contracts starting to emerge at scale is what you look for a lot of the time. I found when I joined Orbit Fab, I didn't quite understand how the VC world and the investment world worked. What I didn't realise is you can just Google investors and find out what stage they invest at. Do they invest at seed stage or pre-seed, or are they Series A, B or growth? Because straight away I can filter my list and talk to the people that want to talk to me as well. And actually that's something I learned as I went through, and I would have saved myself about 6 months from talking to someone like you and figuring it out first. But it's interesting that information is out there. Let's talk a bit about national security. So we want to see the crossover with growth and economic growth and investment, but also national security and defence. So let's just start by framing that question if we can, because it can be quite big. Zoha, I might bring you in here. When we talk about national security, what does that encompass? What does that term mean to you, and how can it apply to space science?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the time when we talk about national security, we're very tempted to think about it in its very kind of rigid military sense, which is definitely important. We know that space contributes heavily in this sense. We know that we have, our missile early warning systems, a lot of our command and control, a lot of, key military operational and various kind of like battlefield aspects are linked to our space environment. But I think national security can also be seen in a more kind of broader sense, and it doesn't have to be the kind of hard military frame that we are sometimes tempted to think of it as. And that can be a broad range of different topics. And I think some of them we've covered today. We've talked about, we've had examples of the Nord Stream pipeline. We've had examples of non-kinetic satellite interference and jamming. And so we've seen that security can be incredibly broad, and it can impact space in various ways. So you can have sort of, your climate security aspects to think about as well in terms of climate change and the potential impacts on that on migration. But also human security aspects. So we've had kind of satellite imaging be really important for our monitoring of human rights violations in Ukraine, Sudan, other sort of, theatres of conflict. But also in the kind of less obvious senses when we look at things like sanctions evasion, so tracking sanctioned shipping vessels, using satellite imagery to observe how clandestine nuclear programs are being developed. So it's been a bit more kind of prevalent in the news with the events of the summer, but we've been using kind of satellite imagery to monitor the changes in the nuclear programs of nations like Iran and North Korea. So I think we have to kind of think about security in its broader sense, and that's something that we do see in the kind of policy literature coming out as well. We see a lot of different kind of conceptualizations of security, and the kind of recognition that the very kind of nature of space science and science and technology is an element of security in itself. And we talk about this idea of a national goal to be a science and technology superpower in the kind of the national space strategy and other related documents, and what that might mean for our own national security in terms of our resilience, the way that we project ourselves globally. And so I think, when we start thinking about security, it is important to have those discussions about framing, because we can take, more of a focused, narrow approach, but it can sometimes be beneficial to zoom out and think about just how kind of broad and encompassing space's relationship with security can be.
Thank you. I hadn't thought about the sanctions monitoring. That's a really good point. It's another use for Earth observation, other data that when you think about it, of course, why wouldn't you do that? And Alexandra, thinking about practical examples now, or anything you've seen or heard of, have you got an example of when a space science researcher or project has spun out into a successful national security capability or successful company that helps bring this to life?
I mean, that's not an example. I think 80% of space industry somehow using national security budgets, right? And we love it, because for us, it's actually what made it a venture model, right? So in the US now, because the US is our main market, in the US, we say for each dollar of VC money, we want to see $3 of government money. And if we don't see that in the financial model, then we say the founder is not capital efficient, right? So, and for my investors, I say, you invest $1, you get 4. They're like, amazing, like it's great, So that deep tech is the only industry which does that, right? There's no one else. You're not getting the same leverage in like fintech or crypto or like software development. But what does it mean for me, right? So we don't invest in defense on its own. I mean, it's kind of many consideration from ethical to some of the, I don't understand how the only defense can become a venture model. But things like B2B B2C B2G model, getting into the B2B. So defense contracts, national security contracts, becoming like a jump start for a commercial model. Let's say one of our companies, which is portfolio companies which we have invested, Zoha space system, which are developing a next generation GPS. Imagine each iPhone will have a new chipset with a 10 centimeter accuracy of GPS. Great. It takes hundreds of millions build that. But who needs a next generation GPS now? Drones. Of course, if government can sponsor like next 2-3 years of development and the product can catch up and develop and then switch to the even bigger commercial market, that's exactly what we want to see. For me, as an investor, we call it resilience of business model. I mean, we're not going to become a unicorn, a decacorn, just doing drones. But we want to see that kind of, okay, now they have some contracts, they're doing that, right? So that's how we see that. And, I would say 80% of our portfolio companies have some sort of support from national security. It's different in different markets, different, I would say, ways how people do that. But for us, it's good.
Interesting. I've written down your stats about government funding to VC funding. That's useful as a benchmark. I wonder if that would work in the UK. I'll leave that question with all of you. And I wanted just to play a little bit more on the national security and the interplay with space science. And Zoha, coming back to you, I sort of start from the assumption that space science is its thing and national security is its thing, and then they come together. Actually, do you think space science should be influenced by what national security needs, or should they exist in two separate vacuums?
I mean, if we go back to kind of the Cold War, and I am a historian, so sorry to cast your minds back to the past. But if we go back to the Cold War, we see that, the kind of traditional Western space programs that did exist in the early Cold War days were rooted in this national security agenda. And so I think, to kind of echo what a lot of my kind of colleagues believe and what we've been kind of saying in our testimonies to the House of Lords Committee and other things, it would be a disservice to try and argue that these two entities exist separately, because it would be kind of untrue to the reality that we live in. A lot of the space tech that we have is inherently dual use. And this is something that, we're recognizing in things like the recent German space strategy, which talked a lot about how even if, it's not intended to, a lot of space tech could be targeted in conflicts because of its inherent dual use nature. So, an example of that was the Viasat hack in 2022 and the subsequent kind of statements we saw from the Russian government that said that, any sort of space operations or satellites that could be aiding the Ukrainian Ukrainian forces could be seen as a legitimate target. And that's dangerous in the sense that that is a, parameter that is set by that particular power. It's not something that we can kind of control ourselves. So I think my opinion on this whole kind of conundrum is that, whether we like it or not, that interplay and that relationship does exist. And these two sectors are quite inherently intertwined. So it's important to kind of embrace that relationship and to think about how we can build resilience in the face of that. And to kind of recognize the interplay of those, because that denying that link would only kind of leave us behind, some of our allies, but also our adversaries who kind of readily embrace this relationship already. Okay, and in the UK, I'm thinking about a good example of
of space weather there. We've heard a bit about it today. I know see some people that I know are deeply involved in space weather as an example of a national security priority. It's not a military priority potentially, maybe it is a little bit, but there's a national security and resilience piece there that plays through, and there's a strong requirement pull all the way into space science, which actually gives us some really strong national capability. I wonder if that's the same in other parts of the sector, or now it is starting to be as we broaden our understanding of the resilience risks inherent from space and being dependent on space for our economy. You mentioned how other nations think about this and don't want to be left behind. I'm interested because both of you got experience. I think you're from Singapore, and I've read some of your papers about the Middle East. How do other countries balance science and security? How do they do it? And either of you is welcome to jump in first if you can.
I'll let Alex go ahead.
I'll just comment on I think previous Zoha's comment as well about kind of what like during Cold War we had Gagarin, we had Apollo, we landed on the moon, and then in the last 25 years of collaboration we had ISS, right? So competition is good, and for me as a VC investor, like I am basically one of my macro thesis which I'm using is competition between China and US. They want to build the best robots. They want to land on the moon first. They want to be like, they want to put like private commercial stations and everything. That's good for me because competition drives progress. Competition drives innovation. Competition drives more government money. And as you already mentioned, some of the deep tech sectors are flooded with money, right? So which is good for us. I think Singapore has similar programs as well and there, by the way, there's a big conference happening in Singapore, Space Summit in February. If anyone wants to join, so I'm going to be there as well. So yeah, there's kind of grants, contracts, programs, and everything. So I don't know exactly. I don't see like the kind of. It's difficult to describe the separation between science and national security, but I think it's very interconnected now.
Yeah, and in terms of kind of different national perspectives, we've already had some discussion today about the ESA potentially filling that security gap that other kind of traditional allies might leave behind. And we've seen kind of in NATO, where there is this kind of acceptance of space as an operational domain of warfare, that kind of very kind of proactive approach to integrating kind of civil commercial actors with defense priorities. I think it's the civil commercial strategy or something, or the NATO, commercial space strategy, that talks about linking those commercial priorities with NATO operational and defense objectives. The Middle East is a really interesting story because we kind of see in some of the big powers there, like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, that inching towards something that we have kind of hinted at in UK space doctrines, which is about that idea of becoming a kind of superpower in space, or an advancing space power, jumping beyond that kind of role as a middling space power to something a bit more substantial. And we've seen a kind of a push for that a bit more in the Middle East, where Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, space is a core pillar of its economic, its security, its technological growth. And the idea of becoming a science and tech superpower is really integral to that vision of growth that they have in the country. Similarly, in the UAE, the space program is developing quite quickly. And so we've seen in those two particular nations the use of kind of space, science and technology as a soft power tool to project that influence. And Saudi Arabia in its last few years has, since 2018, I believe, when the program was kind of really kind of kicking into gear, we've seen them send, astronauts to the ISS, and we've seen a lot more kind of progression in their space program. So it's interesting that these are two countries that really embrace the kind of the soft power potential of space science and technology. And it's something that we talk a lot about doing in the UK, but we're seeing kind of in action in these other geographies. Obviously, those come with their own nuances and, other aspects to think about, but that's the kind of perspective that we see in that region.
And I was struck I was thinking about Europe as you were talking about that as well. So we certainly see the French and the German national security apparatus pushing a lot of the space agenda now in those countries. That won't be a surprise to many people in the room. I don't know if the UK Ministry of Defence is as muscular with its space agency as they are in other countries, but certainly we can see that starting to come through now and flowing through ESA, as you said. And Alex, I was struck by what you said in terms of the benefits, if that's the way of putting it, of the strategic competition between China and America. That is now fueling what is really a boom in American defense space tech, because they are pushing hard to retain their position as the preeminent space power. They sort of outcompeted Russia, I would suggest, is my reading of it, in the space domain. And now there's a new challenger on the block who you could argue is outcompeting America in China's space. Certainly in my world of refueling spacecraft, one of the most noteworthy events this year is China refueled the first spacecraft in geostationary orbit. So they now have an orbital logistics chain. They can sustain and maintain their force more than the US can do it, because they can do that, and they've demonstrated they can do it already. All of a sudden, the interest from American defense investors in my company, Orbit Fab, shot up. So we had a good level of interest before then, but all of a sudden it really accelerated, because they can see the need to push and get that capability and not be left behind as well. And just thinking about now the downsides or the risks or the vulnerabilities, if the UK doesn't integrate science and the military world correctly, if we don't make the steps that maybe others are taking already, what do you see as the potential risk that might come from that? I'm going to start with you again, Zoha, then come to you, Alex.
Yeah, I think it's kind of just echoing what you both have kind of been discussing in your own answers is, if we do have that failure to integrate, we are significantly falling behind our kind of traditional security adversaries when it comes to things like that. So China developing its, space capabilities has significant impacts for us because, as we all are aware, space is, and to borrow a term that's used quite a lot in my kind of academic sphere, it's a global commons. So the actions of one space power can have significant consequences for the kind of operation and sustainability of all space powers in orbit. So, if we potentially fall behind in developing the capabilities that might be needed to kind of address these potential risks and threats that come with the advancements of other countries, we kind of lose a sense of potential security and resilience that we could have. And I think it's kind of important, and it's been discussed in a lot of the policy papers that we've seen about this idea of the UK setting the agenda on sustainability and being able to kind of match the potential risks that might come from the proliferation of those activities in orbit. But I think kind of like touching on what Alex said about challenges can be good for, growth and investment, but challenges also potentially bring that kind of added risk of operating in an environment where, it's very difficult to regulate, especially internationally. We're seeing a lot of kind of stalling of progress on some very kind of fundamental measures on sustainability, peace and transparency at these kind of global forums like the United Nations. So I think combining kind of the kind of lack of regulation, the potential kind of storming ahead of our adversaries and developing capabilities that could risk our own orbital activities. For me, the biggest risk is that falling behind and that struggling to catch up and to kind of build our resilience, protect our assets amidst that kind of constantly changing orbital environment.
Thank you. Alex, anything to offer on that?
I don't like the current situation that we talk about defense as a kind of strategic focus. I think it should not be happening. I hope none of this in this room like what's happening in the world today. But in the same time, I think how do we use it for kind of advance our civilization, advance our society, right? And sustainability is a good example. And I know that companies pivot. I know they say, hey, we've been doing like sustainability, but now we have defense on our PowerPoint, right? So it's good. I mean, it's entrepreneurs, right? They know how to do it. But also, I think we shouldn't forget about long-term objectives. And if you can have roadmap where we can say, okay, this is what we need to deliver today just to prove our security, and in the future we have a roadmap to sustainability. So it's kind of the same technology which is going to help us. That's how I think about our own portfolio companies. That's how I think about my approach to investment. And the reason why we don't like sustainability as investors, to some extent, is that if any economical crisis will hit, sustainability budgets as the first one will be out, right? And sustainability contracts will be the first one will cut. The companies will lose revenue. Defense, in the other side, if a startup has a defense budget contract, they're not going to give budget to technologies which doesn't work. If they secure a defense budget, I need to do less due diligence, right? It's kind of a shortcut for me. I know it's proven, I know it works. And the government budget don't go to companies which don't work. So that's how that's for me. But of course, overall long-term roadmap would have all mapped together.
Interesting. I'm going to come out to the audience for questions in just a minute. So if you have any, please stick your hand up. Interesting what you said. I've gone through the fairly long process of getting an ESA contract, right? So I've got a UKSA grant, gives me a seal of approval. I've then got an ESA contract, an ESA delivered mission gives me a different level seal of approval. I wonder if a defence contract gives you a seal of approval in the eyes of VCs in the same way it does for us in the space sector. Because a lot of us have been given, ESA have given us a technical kicking and we know what that is involved. I don't know if we have the same view of a defence contract giving us the same level of scrutiny. Maybe it does. I will win a defence contract soon and tell you all. For now, let me open up the floor to questions, if I may. I'm going to go right to the back to start with to make my roving mic guy run.
Thank you. Alan Cross from STFC, looking after the Northwest Space Cluster. I was once with a group of researchers who all agreed that in a few years' time, farmers will need to be experts in Earth observation data. And they all nodded, and I asked them, are delivery drivers experts in satellite PNT, or do they just push a button? The general public doesn't care what advances are made in flight dynamics for airframes or engine efficiencies. They care if they can get on holiday efficiently and inexpensively. We're always told, and we always talk amongst ourselves at events like this, that we must speak their language. We must engage them in the story. And how do we square the circle? Because they don't care, nor should they. They care with getting on with their lives. They can't have the same understanding that we have, as they can't know about quantum and material sciences and a whole range of things. I think this may change with defence in the next few months, by the way, that suddenly space may appear to be very interesting. But how do we square that circle in talking to the public and talking to different audiences that we want to talk to who actually may not be receptive?
Thank you, Alan. Talking to the public, talking the public's language as well as that of growth and security. Would either of you want to take that question?
I mean, I use LLMs for that. A lot. So, I mean, when I talk to different investors, if I talk to a real estate investor, if I talk to investor in public markets, equity and bonds, and if I talk to people who made money on Bitcoins, I'll use different pitch to invest in my fund, right? So people who've done business in different kind of, and it helps a lot. I mean, of course, it's a joke about LMs, but of course, it's a tailored message, right? And I know I'm a physicist by myself. I spent so many years in that community and society. We all would like to share, and I know how people say, no, we cannot use the same data scientists for SAR data and hyperspectral data, right? I used to work at HSBC here in Canary Wharf. No one ever mentioned to me, like, this is the data you use. If you don't know how to use it, you get fired. And it can be like graph database, time series database, whatever database, right? You have to learn quickly, right? And I was like, that's I had no choice, right? And I was like, why we kind of when we talk to people about satellite data, for example, I think saying, oh, you have to hire 20 data scientists to use different types of data. Of course, we make people scared of using that, right? It's kind of making it more difficult and creating less cognitive barrier already. So I don't have an answer. I guess the easiest one is LLMs.
Zoha, anything from you?
Yeah, I think, that's the $1 million question. I was at a nuclear conference recently talking about nuclear weapons in orbit. And I actually genuinely had a traditional nuclear academic come up to me and be like, is it such a bad thing if a nuclear weapon explodes in orbit? Like, would it really be so bad? And that was a major shock to me. But, I had to step back and think about, to somebody who isn't familiar with that environment and familiar with all of the different kind of aspects of it, it really is a question. So I agree. I think it's all about kind of tailoring your message to your audience. And there's some conventional ways to do that. We've seen, more kind of policymaker focused approaches, like I think it was DSIT and UK Space Command who ran the Day One Without Space workshop that really tried to, drill home those messages about this is just how much impact space has. For the general public, it might be, things like, and to draw on my nuclear background, things like popular media. We've seen the impact that, some of you who are of the older generation might remember the movie Threads, the impact that had for the imagining of nuclear weapons in the public consciousness. So it really might be a case of exploring these more unconventional methods to communicate that message and thinking about the different avenues. If something that we're doing, currently doesn't work, are there potentially more creative ways we could go about doing it? So I agree with Alex. I don't necessarily have the answer here, but I think we might have to start thinking a little bit more creatively about the way we go about it.
Thank you. Put your hands up if you have any more questions. I've just come over to Chris over there. Just while we're doing that, Alan, when I'm talking to investors, I talk about national security, return on investment. When I'm talking at the school gate, as I did this morning, someone says, "What do you do?" And I said, "I build petrol stations in space." They go, "Okay, fair enough." And then we move on from there. Right? It depends on how you simplify into what you do and how it works as well. Chris, over to you.
Well, just on that point, I was asked what I used to do, and I said I did space engineering. They said, "Oh, you work for IKEA then?" So you never can tell. I'd like to broaden the definition of space science to space sciences and therefore the earth sciences. 5 to 6 years ago, we had a program in the UK called the International Partnership Program, which was quite successful, bringing together entrepreneurs and climate scientists and earth scientists and so on, and really demonstrated the soft power you get in terms of climate mitigation type technologies using Earth observation and telecoms in countries that had challenges. I'm therefore rather puzzled to see in the CMIN activities, the UK seems to now be stepping back away from Earth observation, and yet it seems to be the no-brainer because you've got America not interested in climate mitigation at all, so the services are up for grabs. China itself isn't that bothered either. So it's a strong European play. The UK has a strong earth science community. We seem to have an entrepreneurial collaboration in the past that could still be successful. So where is it going wrong? Now, I would suggest that one thing we learned with IPP was that at the end of the day, the government is often the customer. And picking up on what Alexandra said, government is a key role in this. And therefore, I'm wondering, is it that the earth science academics in the UK haven't got their pitch right? Is it that the government departments haven't quite figured out how to be better users of climate mitigation data and so on? Because it seems to be an open goal, and yet we seem to be stepping back away from that at this Council of Ministers meeting. So I'd be curious to know how growth and security fits into that agenda.
Let me try that one first, and I'll open up to my fellow panelists. I think if we talked a few years ago about security, we'd have talked about maybe climate change a lot, and space sustainability came up a lot as well. But also we talked about going out there to developing nations and helping to support them to meet their problems. I think in the last couple of years, national security has got a lot more pointy in terms of the definitions that we're using. Now it's about protecting our homeland. And you can see that in the slashing of the aid budget. You can see that in other changes, not related to earth sciences quite as much. But that has a trickle-down effect to those earth sciences, I think, not getting the same treatment they have because people don't see them as helping protecting the people of this country on these shores quite as much. Now, the politics of that, I won't go into. I personally disagree with it. But actually, I think you can see a shift there at the geopolitical level, which has had that ramification. Do either of you want to talk about earth sciences and how that might play in as well?
I think we looked at this as a VC domain, and I think that our conclusion was that there's no market much. And I think that one of the reasons for that is there's no regulations which require companies to use some of the LiDAR data or like hyperspectral data for monitoring their states and monitoring leaks and everything. So I think it's a great technology. It's a great, amazing potential. But yeah, we just don't see that we have a regulatory framework in place for that.
Thank you. Okay. Any more questions? I think I saw one down the front here. Hello, Catherine.
Thanks. I think you mentor with CDL, and so do I. Alex, it's really interesting to hear your perspectives. And I talk to a lot of founders about going for the defense budget to raise their TRLs, even if it's not their natural inclination when they start out. But what I'm seeing now from founders is they're coming back and saying, well, we won that defense contract, but now everybody wants sovereign capability. And that's going to impede our ability to scale. And I'm just wondering, actually, both of you, it's the same question. It's sort of, how do innovators scale to a global market if what they're selling is exquisite capability to individual, national defense clients?
Good to see a fellow CDL mentor. I think it's a fine line, right? So if it's a sidestep and it accelerates the product development, that's great. But if a company completely pivoting and becoming like constructor bureau for government defense, then it's not a venture model anymore. The founder will get rich. I won't get rich as an investor, right? So it's not a VC model anymore. So I think we try to always understand, okay, how the government contracts and the defense contract actually, how far they are from the key strategic products.
And Zoha, anything from you on that one?
Well, I don't really have an economics background, so I'll try to do as much as I can. But I think for me, I think if I'm understanding correctly, that kind of potential private nature could actually be really beneficial in building bridges when it comes to things that are incredibly securitized and kind of viewed as a sovereign capability. And, that kind of speaks to some of the stalemates that we're seeing in terms of the discussions at UN Paros and other kind of international organizations. Is there's a kind of fundamental disagreement on the kind of fundamentals of a lot of the securitized aspects of space. And it means that things that should be, relatively widely accepted to do with, SSA and managing hazards become incredibly politicized. So that could actually be, on the flip side, a real sort of potential to have that kind of neutral private actor who can approach something that is, securitized or turned into like a defense initiative, and sort of bridge that gap and provide a solution to a variety of clients, which could be, sort of various nations. So, hopefully
Thank you. Well, I think as well, as I try and wrap up now, because we're approaching the end of time, looking at how NATO nations deliver their S&T and how they deliver space science and their pull through there is quite interesting. It does seem to be at the moment, if I look at how I look at my customers, there are very much sovereign pockets that you have to enter each market very differently. So if like everyone else, I want to enter the German satellite defense market right now because they've got loads of cash, right? I've got to go and set up a German subsidiary and I've got to hire a German ex-general to go and make those links, for example. That's a high barrier to entry for any business. And so actually you've really got to be certain about the return for that investment. Look, did you bring us to a close? Thank you so much to both my panelists. I'm going to ask you to join us in a round of applause in just a second. Then I'm going to welcome onto the stage our final speaker. But till then, please thank both the panelists for me. See you afterwards.